Get your free copy of the complete tutorial at www.teachucomp.com/free.
You can use the gradient editor to create a new gradient, edit a preset gradient, or delete a gradient. You can also modify the existing gradients, blending more colors that you like into the existing gradients. After selecting the gradient tool in the toolbox, you can either click the gradient sample that appears in the tool options bar, or click the edit button in the tool options bar to launch the gradient editor dialog box. To create a new gradient based on one of the preset gradients, click the preset gradient that you want to use as your sample. You will see the gradient used in the preset display at the bottom of the gradient editor dialog box. You can create your gradient in this area. You can select if you want the gradient to be solid or have noise by selecting your choice from the type dropdown. First, you will examine the options you have if you select solid. You can type a name for the new gradient into the name text box. To set the smoothness of the entire gradient, use the smoothness drop-down to set the slider to the percentage of smoothness you want. At that point, you create the gradient by manipulating the various color stops, opacity stops, and midpoints on the sample gradient shown. The color stops determine what colors will appear within the gradient. You can click within the bottom row of color stops to add a new color stop. You can delete a color stop by clicking it to select it, and then clicking the Delete button in the lower right corner of the dialog box. To edit the color within a color stop, click the color stop to select it, and then click the color box shown at the bottom of the dialog box. Doing this will launch the Color Picker dialog box, where you can then select a new color for the color stop. Note that you can also click the drop-down arrow on the color button to use the Color Swatches panel instead if desired. To change the position of a color stop in the gradient, click and drag it left or right to slide it to a new location on the color stops bar. Also note that when you click a color stop, you will see a small gray diamond appear. This is the color midpoint, which determines where the color changes between the adjacent color stops in the color stops bar. You can also click and drag these color midpoint diamonds to new locations on the color stops bar to change where the colors start to shift between two color stops. To add transparency to a gradient, you must change the opacity stops at the top bar of the gradient. You can add and remove opacity stops the same way that you add color stops. Click into the opacity bar side of the gradient sample to add a new opacity stop. You can delete them by clicking to select them, and then clicking the Delete button in the lower right corner of the dialog box. To change the opacity level of an opacity stop, click it to select it. Then click the Opacity drop-down and change the opacity percentage with the slider as needed. This can add various transparent and opaque gradient areas to the gradient if desired. When the gradient looks the way that you would like, click the Add to Preset button to save the gradient as a new preset gradient for future use. If you don't want to save it, just click the OK button to use the selected gradient with the gradient tool. If you selected the Noise gradient type from the type drop-down, you will create a gradient that contains randomly distributed colors within a color range that you specify. First, set the roughness for the gradient using the drop-down slider provided. The higher the number, the more color striations appear within the gradient. In the Color Model drop-down, select which color model you want to use for the gradient, RGB or HSB. Then use the three color sliders below to change the possible color range used for the gradient. To the right of that, you can check the Restrict Colors checkbox to prevent the colors from oversaturating, and also check the Add Transparency checkbox to add transparency to the gradient if desired. After you have the gradient settings the way that you would like, you can click the Randomize button to produce a new gradient sample with the settings you specified. When the gradient sample looks the way that you would like, you can then either click the Add to Preset button to save it as a new preset, or click the OK button to apply the gradient using the gradient tool.
Like what you see? Pick up your free copy of the complete tutorial at www.teachucomp.com/free.